I fight for the men I've held in my arms, dying on foreign soil. I fight for their wives and children whose names I heard whispered in their last breath. I fight for we few who did come home, only to find our country full of strangers wearing familiar faces. I fight for my people, impoverished to pay the debts of an empire too weak to rule them, yet brands them criminals for wanting to rule themselves! I fight so that all the fighting I've already done hasn't been for nothing. I fight because I must.
Ulfric Stormcloak, son of High Stormcloak and former disciple of the Greybeards, entered the bounds of Elder Scrolls lore by the beginning years of the Fourth Era. His father's reign as a Jarl carried on during and after the Great War with the Aldmeri Dominion in the Fourth Era, which indicates that he came into the limelight quickly after his involvement in that war. Even years before a war with the Dominion was planned, Ulfric's adolescent years were spent in an establishment at the throat of the world, called High Hrothgar. The enigmatic Greybeards of Skyrim called upon Hoag's son as a worthy disciple to study the way of the voice with them. I'm not sure why they specifically chose Ulfric, but it might be linked to the genetical origins the Jarls of Eastmarch inherit, and maybe even greater motives than they'd have us publicly know. His journey of enlightenment via the Thu'um ended immediately after news of the Great War reached High Hrothgar. Ulfric felt powerless, sitting atop and watching the masses getting dragged into a war with none other than the Altmer. 10 years had he patiently waited to even remotely master 2 minor dragon shouts, but it was much more than a mortal Nord would have ever bargained for. The Greybeards never intended for his previous knowledge of the Thu'um to be forcefully used, yet his voice was the defining factor of his militant reputation. He quickly left for the nearest garrison and enlisted to ruthlessly fight a crippling war, against the orders of the Greybeards nevertheless. Their Great War broke out, and the Empire was unexpectedly surprised by the ferocity of their Aldmeri Dominion, but the Empire endured the battles fought against them for days on end, establishing themselves as a tenacious army, but ultimately weak enough to resist the ferocious nature of the Aldmeri Dominion. Ulfric was the main harbinger of motivation throughout the earlier lifespan of the war, but his fearless attitude is what basically led him into the hands of the Dominion. He was cautiously but brutally interrogated, physically and even more mentally. The exact psychological practices the Thalmor employed to weaken Ulfric's state of mind are unknown, but they intentionally bred rage and hatred within Ulfric, emotions which inadvertently conformed to the Thalmor's future motives. Their main point of interest was deceiving Ulfric in a way which would introduce a sense of destructive loathing towards his behavior in the war as the son of Jarl High Stormcloak. They convinced him that the information that they did manage to extract out of him was crucial for their siege on the Imperial City, implying that the fall of the Imperial City was his burden to carry, and his burden alone, even though the Imperial City fell long before he even uttered the word to the Thalmor. Shortly after breaking Ulfric mentally, they started conceiving a plan which would place Ulfric into the position of an active sleeper asset for the Thalmor, unbeknownst to Ulfric's conscious knowledge. Now, I want to make this topic perfectly clear. I've noticed that anyone in or out of our community always tries to denounce Ulfric's legitimacy because of the Thalmor dossier regarding his position as a Thalmor sleeper agent. But no, he is not willingly relaying crucial information to the Thalmor as an active spy would. He's an indirect asset which would bring about the gradual deterioration and weakening of the Empire, and this would be achieved by the aforementioned rage and hatred they bred in him. Their plan was for Ulfric to be released into a world which he would perceive as surreal, and by that, I mean that he'd be released into a world where the beloved empire that treasured Nordic culture for centuries would completely betray and butcher their founding father, Tiber Septim, and his Aedric relevance on Nirn. It is of note that both Legate Ricka and Galmer Stonefist, lieutenants which we've seen in Skyrim during the Civil War, were actively fighting alongside Ulfric as his companions in the Great War, leading both of them to harbor great amounts of respect for Ulfric as a soldier fighting for the identity of his nation. His escape from the Thalmor's grasp was intentional, and months later he arrived in Skyrim, gazing upon a nationality so distraught by the effects of a weak ruler and his empire. Ulfric felt obliged to hold the tears of his nation. He felt each and every Nord crying out for their cultural legitimacy. Ulfric slowly waited and gathered passionate Nord men which would be implemented into Ulfric's own militia. This militia of his was utilized as a tool of personal rectification, an important variable which led to the Markarth incident. And as most of you know, Markarth is the former drummer stronghold of Nachuan Zel, which was initially occupied by the Dareni elves in the First Era. But their Breton counterparts soon populated the city and led numerous revolts against the elves, and the coming of Tiber Septim's empire diminished all of that though. By the end of the Second Era, Markarth would be heavily occupied by the Nords of Skyrim, and the ongoing conflict that the Reach has endured reflects on both the original Reachmen and the Nords themselves. But during the Great War with the Aldmeri Dominion, the Reachmen successfully usurped and reclaimed the Reach from their Nordic oppressors, and this allowed them to rule surprisingly good, and their citizens have been pleasantly surprised with the prosperity that they've managed to achieve in a mere 2 years. But as I mentioned in every single video, solace is never left uninterrupted, for Ulfric's return would mark a tragic event in history, the Markarth incident. The Markarth incident consisted of Ulfric and his newly formed Stormcloak militia marching on the capital city of the Reach, vowing to reclaim the worship of Talos in the entirety of the Reach. At least these were the terms under which the former Jarl of Markarth, Hrolfdir, had Ulfric yearning to fight. Ulfric and his Stormcloak militia tore open the gates of Markarth, displaying sheer and utter brutality. It is said that Ulfric himself was so empowered by the cause of this battle that his Thuum inadvertently strengthened itself. The Markarth incident would signify Ulfric as quote-unquote the Bear of Markarth, the same bear that spared little to no Reachmen, the same bear that stopped at nothing to preserve his culture, not even genocide. The city was quickly reclaimed, but the scar Ulfric left would set in motion an even bloodier future conflict. Although useful for Skyrim, this event was the critical opportunity the Thalmor used to demand more severe prosecution and administration in regards to the terms of the White Gold Concordat. And this means that Ulfric recklessly gifted them a gateway into further establishing their influence over Skyrim's holds. Hrolfdir and his son Igmund soon learned of the consequences that will come about in light of Ulfric's recent actions. Even the Empire accepted Ulfric's terms in the naive hopes of the Thalmor not finding out. But ironically, Ulfric was the one that led the Thalmor directly to that aforementioned information. Ulfric's direct cooperation with the Thalmor prior to the Markarth incident is vaguely left out. I'm personally not sure if he willingly contacted the Thalmor to relay informants into the hold of Markarth as to wound the Empire drastically, but this would seem counterintuitive in a sense, right? I mean, take it from his perspective. Why would you rally a force of the most combat-hardened Nords you know to ultimately die in place of a far-fetched ulterior motive? Hrolfdir relayed Ulfric's involvement in the Markarth incident, and after a short while, Ulfric was arrested. This was the second time Ulfric was subjected to a false sense of trust. He blamed the arrest of him and his fellow men on the non-existent backbone of the Empire, and how they'd rather sell out their cultural identity to keep the cash cow they called Cyrodiil afloat. Hatred brewed in the confines of this prison cell, and only after this particular prison sentence he'd be released in a substantially more determined manner, commandeering a force filled with prideful nationalism far beyond what we ordinarily see in the real world. His release was met with the death of his father, Hogue. His father perished whilst he was rotting away in a prison cell. What a turn of events. Ulfric was hoping to slightly avenge what was left of his father's legacy, and this prompted him to leave for Windhelm in order to comfort a broken population. As one might suspect, chained events of such unfortune would contribute to the gradual devastation of one's mindset, especially if the livelihood of an entire culture is at stake. At the time of his release from prison, High King Istlaud of Skyrim met the same fate as his father, and a moot for the new High King of Skyrim was in session. The moot chose Istlaud's son, Torygg, as a direct successor to the title of Skyrim's High King. Ulfric was present at this moot, and he adamantly voiced his passion for the independence of Skyrim as a separate state, and this was insanely courageous of Ulfric, for it was treading the lines of treason, something he could have well been sanctioned for. This display of courage extremely impressed the new High King Torygg, a person which harbored a great measure of respect for Ulfric as a proficient war hero, but what cemented Ulfric's superior image in his mind was the attitude that Ulfric openly displayed during the moot, and young Torygg knew the recent extent of the Empire's rampant failure to cater to its citizens, which is why he would have taken up Ulfric on the offer of granting Skyrim its independence, if only Ulfric had given him more time. But Ulfric committed a grave mistake, and this would soon befall him, for he later marched into solitude, determined to challenge the High King Torygg under ancient Nordic traditions, a one-on-one duel. Torygg was left choiceless. He either had to accept the duel or suffer a lifetime of ridicule from the people he governed. Upon accepting the duel, Ulfric unleashed his Thuum onto Torygg's young carcass, flinging him meters into the distance, leaving his skeleton crippled. But the same skeleton would instantly be pierced by the blade of Eastmarch. High King Torygg suffered fatal wounds at the hands of Ulfric Stormcloak, the rightful Jarl of Eastmarch. Ulfric's opposers claimed there wasn't a shred of honor in what he committed. They claimed that he refused to capitalize on the diplomatic possibilities Torygg offered him. Setting this aside, High King Torygg was extremely young, and he was no match for a seasoned war veteran wielding the power of the Thuum. Ulfric's return to Windhelm symbolized the start of the Stormcloak Rebellion and the Skyrim Civil War. The events that conspire after this are completely left to the last Dragonborn's mercy, whether they'd like to aid Ulfric in his mission of granting Skyrim its national independence, or if they'd be the driving force of the Empire reclaiming Skyrim entirely. One thing we do know is that Ulfric manages to escape his captors once again in Helgen, and this was the deciding blow that allowed him to recuperate. But an everlasting theme that haunts Ulfric is the ironic nature of his actions. Every single thing, up until and after he gets captured in Darkwater Crossing, involuntarily served the Thalmor in a productive manner. The death of High King Torygg eliminated the last potential bastion of agreeance Ulfric had, and a notable one at that. Torygg died with the will of potentially seeing through an independent state of Skyrim, but Ulfric's raging quest for dominance hindered that drastically, which also plays into the Thalmor's motives once again. Not to mention how Ulfric's every single attack on the Imperial Legion would facilitate the weakening of the Empire's presence in Skyrim, which they cannot under any circumstance afford, because it would favor the Dominion and prompt an effortless invasion of Skyrim. Although what I just previously said does make logical sense, anti-Stormcloaks in our Elder Scrolls community religiously rely on the argument of Ulfric's position as a dormant asset to the Thalmor, claiming that Ulfric is forever stuck in a loop of indirectly serving the Thalmor. But what if I told you that wasn't necessarily true? The Thalmor's plan for the Skyrim Civil War is to simultaneously cripple both sides, mentally and physically, yet if a specific side were to come out triumphant in a short amount of time, the Thalmor would be left handicapped, and what would be even worse for the Thalmor is if Ulfric prevailed. He'd separate himself from an empire which realistically acts as a puppet state for the Eldmeri Dominion, and I'd reckon that if the Empire prevailed, the Dominion would demand Skyrim on a platter, for they'd wage a new great war if the Empire didn't, and knowing how the Mede dynasty operates, they'd sacrifice a province to keep themselves and their own interests intact. A Stormcloak victory, on the other hand, would give the Nords a fighting chance, rather than letting Skyrim effortlessly fall into the hands of the Dominion, which would come with its fair share of genocides and tragical events. But let's be honest here, both outcomes generate an absurd amount of death nonetheless, whichever way you'd like to put it. The Dominion is a menace best fought with quantity, which is why allied independent provinces would relinquish the might of the Aldmeri Dominion collectively. Ulfric Stormcloak is the harbinger of Nordic nationalism in the Fourth Era. He assembled an army of Nords fierce enough to withstand even the most threatening menace. The rebellion's courage and pride caught the Empire off guard. Their motives for survival were far more driven than that of the war-torn Imperial Legion. Ulfric capitalized on his hatred for the adversaries he encountered. Many sought to wound, cripple, and even silence him. His genocidal acts can never be justified, but the Reachmen would have done the same if their cultural existence was in question. He is by all means a bent product of foreign political wars. All he sees is conquering the boundaries of his enemies, overruling his opposition, and instilling a harsh example of what it meant to be a proud Nord of Skyrim. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I understand that this might be a controversial topic, but I've come to realize his more intricate story is nearly always left uncharted, and this was mainly due to his barbaric notoriety. Thank you for tuning in, this was Xith, and I'll catch you later.